Good morning, everyone. My name is Martin Guerrieria. I'm Global Head of Research for Kantar BrandZ. And let me start by saying a big congratulations to this year's most valuable UK brands. Thanks to Dom and to Winnie for the intro today. And as they said, I'm going to talk about the global trends that we've seen over the course of the last tumultuous 18 months. And we're going to use that as the backdrop to understand what are the implications for UK brand building specifically. But first, let's talk about BrandZ for the uninitiated. So some of you may have worked with Kantar BrandZ before, others may be less familiar, but essentially BrandZ is a massive database of consumer opinion. So we've been gathering data via consumer interviews for more than 20 years now, and over the course of that time, we've interviewed more than 3.9 million consumers. We've gathered data on more than 18,500 unique brands, some of which we've covered in multiple years and in multiple categories. We've got data from more than 500 categories and more than 50 markets. So a truly global study and a huge piece of insight to draw from for everyone at Kantar that you work with, clients and prospects alike. And if we boil down all of that data and all the work we've done over the course of the last 20 years, it's clear that brands have huge potential to add value to any business around the world. So let's begin by looking back to June this year, when we launched our global top 100 most valuable brands. There was lots of insight in that report. If you've not read it, please go to our website and download it. It's still available. And those of you who've worked with Kantar before and come across Kantar BrandZ no doubt will be familiar with this slide, but it's worth spending some time talking about it because the insights on this slide are very important and very powerful for the marketing community. So way back in 2006, we launched our first ever global top 100 most valuable brands. And since that point, we've tracked the share price performance of 4 different indices, the progress of the MSCI World Index, the progress of the S&P 500, as well as 2 portfolios of BrandZ brands. And the first thing you can see is that over the course of that time period, the 2 BrandZ portfolios have hugely outperformed even S&P 500 and MSCI World Index companies. And most interestingly, over the course of the last 18 months, of course, we saw a dip for all 4 of those indices as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. But if we look at the pace of recovery for the 2 BrandZ portfolios, not only have they outstripped where they were prior to the pandemic, they've actually accelerated well past it. So the implications are clear. Strong brands deliver fantastic returns for shareholders, and they're also more resilient in times of crisis. We saw it in the stock market crash of 2008. We're seeing it again during the current pandemic. And I think it's clear that really successful global brands actually appeal to 2 audiences, not just their consumer target, of course, but increasingly the investment community as well. And that's something we're going to come back to with our panel discussion a bit later and explore further. So let's look at some stats from our global top 100 this year to set the scene, as I mentioned earlier. So 2021, the last 12 months, has been a fantastic year of growth for our global top 100. It's been, in fact, a record year of growth for those brands. So we've seen a 42% increase in total brand value for those 100 brands over the course of the last year. That's 4 times the growth rate we would see in a typical year. Those brands as a collective have added more than $2 trillion in the last 12 months, to bring them to a total of over $7 trillion now. And to put that into some context for you, that is equivalent to the GDPs of France, Italy, and India combined. So clearly big numbers, but what does that actually mean in practice? And what it really means is that brand has never been more important. We know that brand building is more important than ever. We know brands are worth more than ever. And we know that as marketers, we've got an unprecedented opportunity to add value to our businesses through building great brands. And if you've worked with Kantar before, you'll have heard us talk about the key ingredients for brand building. So we talk about meaningful difference. So meaningful difference, but salience is the third key element that amplifies a brand's meaningful difference. So I'll just talk a little bit about what those 3 things actually mean in practice. So being meaningful is all about being relevant, meeting functional needs for consumers, but also building an advantageous emotional connection versus the competition. Difference is about being literally different and standing out from the crowd in a positive way, but also being seen as a leader and a trendsetter in your particular category versus your competitors. And salience is the simplest of the 3. It's about amplifying meaningful difference, coming easily to mind when consumers are making some kind of purchase decision. So we know that instilling and building a brand with meaningful difference is the goal for marketing. And we know that meaningfully different brands perform better and increase in brand value at a faster rate by using BrandZ brand valuations data. If we look at brands that are the most meaningfully different versus the least meaningfully different over time, we can see that those with higher levels of meaningful difference grow at a much faster rate. So we know that meaningful difference is the goal. And we'll come back a little later to explore the themes for the UK specifically, which can make a brand meaningfully different and set a brand up to grow. Now, one question our clients have asked us a lot since the beginning of the pandemic is, what are the key ingredients for growth? I'm sure you can guess the answer, but we can prove that with BrandZ data. So what we did was we divided brands into two groups since the start of the pandemic. Those brands that have grown a reasonable amount in market share and those that haven't. And we looked at those two groups using BrandZ data at the beginning of the pandemic. And basically we saw that those brands that have grown since the pandemic began actually were much more meaningful, different and salient to their consumers to begin with. So it certainly shows that marketing investment is very much worthwhile. And it also helps answer the question around, should a brand pause marketing investment when times get tough? Absolutely not. This data clearly supports that point, and it's a point we'll come back to a little later as well. So if we look to our global top 100 for some inspiration and examples of brands that have been successful over the course of the last 18 months, two that stand out as new entries into our global list are Zoom and Spotify. I'm sure we've all interacted with those brands over the recent past, and both of them had very strong consumer relationships, very strong brand equity with their respective audiences prior to the pandemic. Yes, Spotify was much bigger than Zoom, but Zoom already had the beginnings of a very strong brand. And the fact that those brands have been able to deliver as our needs have changed around connectivity and entertainment, as the world around us have changed, that explains why those brands have been such a success. They're now much less of a considered choice. They're now much more of a habit for all of us. And that's because of their convenience, their ease of use, their seamless delivery. And if one brand is the poster boy or girl for marketing investment when times are hard, Corona is a great example. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the news stories, the fake news at the beginning of the pandemic, which in some quarters labelled Corona as potentially being part of the coronavirus problem. It was out there that Corona beer virus was a term that was trending on Twitter at times, a concern for their business. But actually, we've seen that Corona has thrived over the course of the last year. They've turned coronavirus into Corona dollars. Their global brand has grown by 13%, the fastest growing, or one of the fastest growing beer brands that we've seen, massively outperforming the beer category overall. And that again is as a result of the marketing investment, the brand building that Corona did prior to the pandemic. They built a very clear identity, they built very clear distinctive assets, and those factors combined have really not just protected the brand, but as I said, enabled the brand to thrive in adversity. So we've talked about the global top 100. We've talked about the global list as a backdrop. Let's bring it back to the UK now and think about what we can learn based on the performance of UK brands this year. And we've seen two interesting things emerge at a category level. So we know that the world has changed. We know that consumer needs have changed as well. And brands within certain categories have seen larger increases than others. So two big consumer needs, one around necessity, partly as a result of some of the physical lockdowns that we've faced, and partly as a result of the need for release and escape. So within necessity, we've seen brands relating to logistics, online delivery, payment networks, food and beverages and utilities really go from strength to strength, partly for obvious reasons, but partly as a result of the strength of their brands. And in terms of release and entertainment, we've seen media and entertainment brands, online gambling, apparel, fast food and alcohol have a good 12 months as well. So we're seeing the UK top 75 really reflecting the changing needs and the changing behaviours of society overall. And interestingly, what do the British do when times get tough? We put the kettle on, we have a cup of tea, and we've seen Tetley Tea enter our top 75 for the first time this year. So what could be more idiosyncratically British than a tea brand entering our ranking over such a difficult time? So definitely an interesting one to highlight and talk about later as well. And this slide really shows what a roller coaster it's been for the total value of our top 75 in the UK. We've seen global go from strength to strength, but in the UK, our top 75 list really did see a massive downturn, as those of you who tuned in for last year's presentation will no doubt remember. But happily, we have seen a major recovery in the total value of our top 75 this year. Not only have we recovered to pre-COVID levels, we've actually recovered slightly ahead of COVID levels if we look at the total value in 2019. So we're certainly seeing the green shoots of growth coming back for UK brands, which is obviously a really positive thing for us all. And Woody mentioned this earlier, the rumour was there was only one UK brand left in our global list, and that's absolutely true, unfortunately. So Vodafone is the only UK brand left in our global top 100 list this year. And that is a result partly of the fact that other UK brands have simply not been able to keep pace with the huge acceleration we've seen in our global top 100, but it's also partly due to Vodafone's financial might and also brand equity strength. But it's worth mentioning and worth remembering that when we look at BrandZ data, Vodafone actually ranks 6th in brand equity terms versus other UK communications providers. So even for the UK's most valuable brand, there is still an opportunity to brand build further and add further value to the business. And that should serve as a reminder to the basics of what a BrandZ valuation actually is. So when you're looking at a BrandZ brand value, what you're looking at is the literal dollar quantification of the intangible asset of brand that sits in the mind of consumers. And our valuations team arrive at that number by taking real-world financial data and combining it with proprietary, unique BrandZ brand equity data, which we call brand contribution, to calculate that brand value. So for marketing, brand and insights teams in the UK, the goal is to focus on improving brand equity as a way to positively influence brand value and ultimately add value to your business. So we've talked about meaningful difference a lot. I'm going to talk about it again briefly by putting the UK top 75 in context against other high-performing brands from other markets where we have BrandZ data. And you can see, if we look at meaningful difference for the UK's most valuable brands, it's by no means a disaster. The UK doesn't sit bottom of the list against some of those markets, but there's clear work to do for UK brands to improve their meaningful difference as a collective and hopefully rise up that list in the coming years. And obviously, the key question is, well, how do we do that? We understand that meaningful difference is the goal, but what are the key steps and the key factors that can help us get there? And by analysing the depth of our UK BrandZ database, we've identified 4 factors that Dom mentioned earlier that show a relationship with meaningful difference. And we're not saying that every single brand needs to tick all of these boxes, but the more of these boxes that can be ticked, the more likely a brand is to grow in brand value in the UK specifically. So next, we're going to take each of these 4 pillars in turn, talk a bit about them, and share some examples with you as well. So the 4 pillars are communicating creatively, innovating meaningfully, building brand responsibly, and offering and delivering unique experiences for customers and consumers as well. So beginning with communicating creatively. And this pillar is all about creating content that really stands out from the crowd, builds positive associations for your brand. And I think we all know that creativity equals memorability and helps brands combat commoditization as well. So before we look at some examples, I think it's worth bearing in mind the latest IPA Bellwether report, which is telling us that for the first time in 5 quarters, marketing budgets in the UK overall are basically showing a tip back into the positive. So the battle for share of voice is absolutely back on. But of course, we know it's not just about share of voice, it's about quality of communications as well. And 2 good brand examples, which feature in our UK most valuable brands list, Just Eat and Deliveroo. Clearly they're competitors, but clearly both have recognised the importance of communications within their particular category to differentiate their brands. So an average score in terms of perceived communications is an index of 100. Both of these brands are not just well above that index, but have actually improved their score with the quality of their marketing and their communications over the course of the last couple of years. And both of them have clearly recognised creative content as a way to differentiate within what is becoming an increasingly commoditized category. And a brand we'll hear from later on our panel, Greggs. So if we look again at our communications data from BrandZ, couple of years ago, Greggs was actually slightly below average in terms of perceived quality of communications. But again, this is a brand that's recognised the importance of investing in high quality communications and have now actually tipped ahead of the average UK brand in terms of their perceived creative quality. A brand that had great success prior to the pandemic, took a hit like many retail brands, but has certainly recovered, and Greggs' share price is now flying again. And partly that's because CEO Roger Whiteside has recognised the fact that marketing investment has played a key role in Greggs' success and has been quite vocal in the press talking about the brand's intention to continue to invest in marketing in future. So 3 good examples of brands that really do communicate creatively. Second pillar is about innovating meaningfully. So this is about having an edge in terms of meeting consumer needs better than others, better than your competitors, particularly as needs around us change. It is absolutely not innovating for innovation's sake. And if we look at some examples of brands performing well on this particular pillar, Dyson may seem an obvious example here, but it is a brand that has genuinely delivered game-changing innovations time and time again. And it uses those innovations as a way to add value to the category, justify a higher price, and drive value share. It's also over the years built some very powerful, distinctive assets, and its product excellence continues to drive success far beyond the UK. Another brand we'll hear from elsewhere within Kantar Talks is Brewdog. So clearly a brand that's faced its controversies recently, but there's no doubt this is a brand that is very committed to innovation and delivering high quality innovation, whether that's through expanding range, irreverent marketing, and more recently becoming the world's first carbon negative beer. And quite recently as well, Brewdog last year was named as the Marketing Society's Brave Brand of the Year. So another example of a brand that is committed to innovation and is reaping the rewards in brand value terms as a result of that. But we also know a lack of meaningful innovation can be a problem as new competitors emerge. And if we look at the UK TV provider market, or video entertainment as we call it, we definitely see that in action. So in the UK, there's no doubt that brands, the streaming services like Disney+, Amazon Prime and Netflix are seen as particularly innovative by UK consumers, and they're able to offer fantastic quality content at comparatively low prices. And that is causing problems for some of the bundling services and the traditional terrestrial TV channels. So within this space, there's no doubt the battle for quality content is very much on, and ultimately meaningful innovation in that regard will determine the long-term winners. Third pillar, building brands responsibly. So I think we all know this is an increasing consumer expectation of brands. So brands really need to practice what they preach rather than paying lip service to ethical issues like sustainability, inclusion and diversity, and the treatments of staff and suppliers. Consumer trust is very hard to win, but is much easier to lose. In terms of examples, a UK brand that really stands out in this space is The Body Shop. So it's a brand that's been around for a long time now, founded in the mid-70s around ethically sourced, cruelty-free natural ingredients. But it's very clear in our data that today, the brand still retains extremely strong responsibility credentials, some of the highest in our UK database around being perceived to be socially responsible and environmentally responsible as well. And a part of the UK industry that has faced some challenges recently is the UK fashion landscape. And it's been increasingly linked with the need to improve ethical business practices, particularly for fast fashion brands. They've come under increasing scrutiny, but there are signs that some of these brands are making strides to address these concerns and that these efforts are being noticed by consumers. So ASOS, for example, set a requirement for brands sold on the platform to sign up to 4 ethical manufacturing pledges by 2020 to improve supply chain transparency and identify risks. And similarly, Boohoo conducted an independent review of their supply chain and linked executive bonuses to improved workers' rights. And we see when we look at BrandZ data that both of these brands underperformed in terms of dealing fairly with suppliers and treating employees well, if we look at 2020 data. But if we look at the data that we've gathered on BrandZ since those initiatives came to pass, we have seen an improvement. Both of those brands within the fashion landscape have tipped above average. There's still a lot of work to do for those brands, but we are seeing a positive shift in the right direction. And again, it shows the importance, the fact that building brands responsibly is now an absolute hygiene factor in whatever category that you're building a brand in. And then final pillar is all about delivering high quality, user experiences at all touch points for your brand, whether experience in the product, which is obviously important, or service, but also in the consumer's online and offline journeys. And we know from using data from elsewhere in Kantar that there's been a clear acceleration of consumers buying things online. So using our COVID barometer data, we know that that was the #1 increased behaviour for consumers. And we also know that around half of us were saying that new things we'd found in terms of online stores over the course of the last year have been things that we're going to continue to use moving forward. And using data from Kantar World Panel, we do know, though, that there has been the beginnings of a partial recovery for physical stores. So bricks and mortar is certainly not dead. We have seen signs of a bounce for brands that are able to offer experiences to entice consumers back. So within a couple of weeks of restrictions lifting, the high street was back to around a third of the footfall that we saw before. And by the end of August, the high street was trading at around just less than 5% of where it was prior to COVID. So definitely some signs of recovery, and experience will play a key part of that for bricks and mortar brands and stores, of course. And some examples within this pillar. So there's no doubt that Ocado remains a particularly disruptive force within grocery. There are signs now that the brand is beginning to invest more in long-term brand building efforts to improve online experience even further and build on its unique position. And a couple of new entries to finish on. So B&M is a brand that has thrived again over the course of the last 12 months. It offers unique in-store physical experiences. It offers fantastic range to attract people back, and all of that at rock bottom prices, which have obviously become even more relevant to consumers over the course of the last couple of years. And finally, JD Sports really is a great example as a new entry of the confluence of where digital experience meets physical experience. So their digital experience mirrors that of their online stores. They have a vast range both online and offline, and they themselves describe their stores as highly differentiated destinations, a brand that really understands the power of physical retail in terms of meeting consumer demand. So, wrapping all of that together, what are the implications for UK brands specifically? And I want to leave you with 3 things before we go on to our panel discussion today. So when it comes to investing in your brand, an old Chinese proverb for me sums it up best. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So based on the evidence we've seen today, we know that brand building is more important than ever, even in the current environment. Those businesses making a deliberate investment have been best placed to ride out the pandemic and even thrive as the world around us has changed. And as we've seen, meaningful difference is the goal, and we know that 4 themes show a relationship with brand success in the UK: communicating creatively, innovating meaningfully, building brand responsibly, and delivering unique experiences all have the potential to make your brand the obvious choice. So think about how your brand performs in these areas and where you need to focus as a business and a brand. And finally, whatever your starting point, monitoring progress and course correcting along the way will make a big difference on your journey. So whether you're aiming to boost your brand with new content or innovation, a different approach to media, strategy, or an increased focus on CX, your Kantar team is here to help you. So do please reach out to us for a conversation. So thank you for listening to this presentation to kick off Kantar Talks today. Next, I'm going to pass over to our UK Managing Director, Amy Cashman, who's going to chair a discussion of the topics I've talked about, and no doubt many more as well. So we'll be back with Amy shortly. Thank you.
Hi everyone, a very, very, very warm welcome to this panel discussion today. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. For those who don't know me, my name's Amy Cashman. I run the Insights division of Kantar in the UK. And it is my pleasure to be here today with three absolutely fantastic panellists. So let me introduce those. And I'm going in alphabetical order. I always feel when you introduce people, you can't look like you're taking part. So I'm going very clearly in alphabetical order. So I'm going to start with Woldergiorgis, who is the marketing director for food and at Unilever. And Fik is a very experienced global marketer. She's worked in a number of different roles across classical FMCG and also digital marketing roles too. She was at Unilever, she was the Global Digital Transformation Director. She's now, as I said, the Foods Marketing Director. So she's responsible for brands as iconic as Marmite and Hellmann's, which we all know and love. Or hate, as I'm sure you'll come on to, Fik. But she's particularly passionate about purpose-driven marketing and digitally plugged-in marketing. She's a lover of all things tech-related. But interestingly as well, in lockdown, she's got a passion for gardening, I hear, as well. So I don't know if we'll hear anything about that as we go on, but not always tech-related. We've also got Hannah Squirrell joining us, who is the Customer Marketing Director at Greggs. And again, she's a hugely experienced Customer Marketing Director. She's worked all over Tesco and Capital One, Avon Cosmetics, Bennett's Insurance, and she's had agency roles and client-side roles. She's actually been at Greggs since 2017, and she's a member of the Greggs Operating Board. And her role is really placing the brand and the customer at the very heart of the Greggs business. So really, key to some of the successes we've seen with Greggs. And congratulations again to the Greggs team for getting into our UK top 75 for the first time. In terms of Hannah outside of work, well, she did a degree in psychology, and that's led her to a real interest in emotional health and well-being. So she's actually used her time out of work to qualify in a number of different areas. And she's actually a qualified master hypnotist and hypnotherapist, and a back flower remedy practitioner. And she's also a very keen user of Peloton, and probably because she's a great marketing person, she's using all her channels for marketing. She said, actually, if there's any other marketers who would like to get together with her on Peloton, please do get in touch. So there's something else for everyone to think about. And last but by no means least, I have Sophie Devonshire here with me in the studio, which is a treat. And Sophie was appointed CEO of the Marketing Society last year, I think almost in the middle of the pandemic. Yep. Interesting time to start a new role. And Sophie's an enormously experienced business leader. She's an entrepreneur, she's a marketer, and actually a best-selling author, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. But she's worked with many different multinational companies, including P&G and Coca-Cola. She's worked in the Middle East, she's worked in London. She's had her own business, which she's sold, and she's worked in consultancy. And possibly outside of work as well, you're very interested in the speed of ideas, the speed of change in organisations. And so a very interesting fact about Sophie is actually that her book, Super Fast, Lead at Speed, reached #1 in the Amazon charts and was shortlisted for the Business Book of the Year. So I think we can all agree we've got a fantastic panel here today to talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing coming out of our data. So as I get started, I thought it would be worth just recapping a couple of the key points from what Martin said. But I just also really want to encourage the people listening. If you want to ask questions, please do so. I've got an iPad here and questions will be coming through. We've obviously got some things we want to talk about ourselves, but we'll absolutely make time for questions as we go through. So please encourage you to put your questions forward. So if we look at what we've learned from what Martin said, it's really interesting to see the impact that a strong brand can recover faster, can recover better than those brands that were not in that same position before the pandemic. And I think when we see that growth rate, 4 times the growth rate that we've seen in a typical year, you really start seeing the power of investing hard into brands. And I think what we've taken out of it as Kantar, when we've seen this obviously over a couple of years, there is the UK not necessarily keeping pace with that. So whilst, yes, again, in the UK, we see the same thing. We see strong brands building back faster. Why are we not keeping pace with the global top 100? Why would it be that in a nation where we have so much great creative advertising, marketing capability, that we wouldn't have more than one brand in the global top 100. And just before we get into some of the individual pillars Martin mentioned, I think it'd be great to just explore that a bit. So I'm going to start with you, Sophie. What's your views on that? Why would we see British brands struggling to build value in the same way as global counterparts? What are your thoughts on what might be holding them back?
Thank you, Amy. And it's great to be here talking about this because it's such an important subject and so difficult to understand why, when we've got so much going for us, there's not more we can do. And hopefully this kind of conversation is just the start of changing that. I think there is a reality of the need for us to be properly understanding that this is a global world.
Yeah.
And of course, here we're focused on what's happening in the UK, quite rightly. But each of the marketers I see who are really leading change do have that kind of peripheral vision that I think you need in marketing to look up and outside your category and around. And the more I see, within our global network, the ideas, the inspiration that comes from other parts of the world, the more I recognise sometimes that perhaps we are a little focused on looking at the same type of challenges. So maybe one of the perspectives is just to make sure we continue to understand that humans are global beasts, and the excitement of recombinant innovation, where you take an idea from somewhere and put it together with something else, can come from a bit more of a truly global perspective. And the great thing about this kind of conversation today and what's happened in the last year is, in some ways, I do think we are more global because we are connecting with people over Zoom, God bless that growing brand, and in other ways. So perhaps a little bit more of a excitement about the fact that ideas can come from anywhere may help us in the UK.
That's really interesting. And of course, with Brexit, British brands are looking to grow in different markets than perhaps they have previously, and that wider global view, comes into play again there, doesn't it? If I could come to you, Fik, what's your take on the situation?
I couldn't agree more with what Sophie is saying. Sorry, I'm hearing a lot of echo. Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you very clearly, yeah. Sorry if you're hearing echo, but we can hear you.
Brilliant. As I was saying, I couldn't agree more in a sense that it's specifically when it comes to what we do, I don't think it's for lack of skills. I don't think it's for lack of budget or anything like that. I think it's more around getting inspirations in terms of what's happening outside. Bringing the outside in is the key thing to focus on. For me, for example, it was in my team. I always encourage my team to look at the outside of the four walls of Unilever, what's going on outside of the company, what's going on outside of the UK. That will help us see a whole lot of new ideas, a whole lot of new inspirations that we probably might not be exposed to if we're just focused and if you're quite kind of insular around what our brands and categories are focused on. That's the bit that we need most. I think the inspiration that will help us be a little bit more bolder and creative around our marketing initiatives.
And Hannah, if I could ask you as well your thoughts, because obviously BrandZ is a very sort of inherently British brand. I mean, what's your take?
I think a lot of the brands that you've been covering in the study are heavily tech, as we know. But in terms of the accessibility point, I think is really important. So those brands don't need to rely on kind of where they're based. They have a global presence. The millennials that are generally shopping with them and enjoying their products are not driven by the culture of those brands, etc. They're just used to having accessibility to every product anytime they want it, wherever they're based. And I think a lot of brands talk about being global and acting local, and almost BrandZ is a local brand acting at a community level. So as well, we really serve the individual community as well as nationally. But I think these tech companies do have a significant advantage based on the consumer buying behaviours that are coming through around. It really doesn't matter where people are based and how accessible the channels are. People can get these products anywhere, and that's kind of the culture that people are used to.
Yeah, and I know if you talked recently in a Sunday Times article, Sophie, about the concept of organisations reshaping at this point in time as we, I don't think we can say we're out of the pandemic yet, but the point we're at, and as they're doing that alongside thinking about recovery and rebuilding, I just wondered, could you say a little bit more about that concept of reshaping and how it might relate to some of the ways we could accelerate, British brands' performance and things like the Top 100?
It's such an important moment right now, I think, because so many organisations and brands and marketers are seeing this as the inflection point. They've been through either a torrid time or sometimes a great time, depending on which brand you have. But certainly there's a few things happening, not just with the pandemic, but with the other societal trends going on, where this is a moment where people are reassessing what role business has in people's lives, in society, in politics, and in the world generally. So I think there's something for us all as we're talking about this here today to consider this a little bit of a pause moment to think and work out what happens next. And the reason I talked about reshaping is because amongst, marketing society has so many different interesting members in all kinds of different categories and whatever. And some of them are really focused on rebuilding and recovering. But so many others, and often those people as well, are thinking about how they reshape their relationships with clients, with customers, with consumers, how they fundamentally reshape what's happening inside their organisation. And I think this is both one of the most brilliant things about being in marketing right now, but also one of the hardest things, is that potentially our role is much, much more than just marketing communications and connecting with the customer. It's not just getting the insight in, but it's also about how we can build the brand and the experience and the organisation from inside out. So trying to be the ones that are helping shape what happens next and taking that leadership role is really exciting. And this is an opportunity for us because so many companies are properly thinking right now. But it's also quite overwhelming, I think. There's so much going on for people, and lots of our members and marketers I know are pretty exhausted.
Yeah, of course. And Hannah, could I come to you on that as well? Because obviously, Greg's had an enormous challenge during lockdown. One of your main route to market was kind of closed for a long period of time. I mean, how do you feel you guys sort of approach that challenge and that sort of, and how do you see that evolving in the future as people come back more to the high street and the in-store experience?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a difficult time for the whole industry, and we were part of that. To be closing our shops was really, really devastating. But from a marketing perspective, we have a very engaged audience. So for us, it was making sure that we kept talking to our customers and we kept them engaged. And I guess for the first time ever, Greg's actually shared our recipes, and so we've had a lot of fun at home making and baking the various concoctions of our products, which was great to see. But then, of course, as well, it was really important that we kept in touch all the time with our colleagues. Our colleagues make our brand and that experience you have in our shop. So for us, it was very much continued engagement, both with our colleagues and with our external customers, just to keep the brand front of mind, because I think we all went into this thinking it'd be over in a few weeks.
Yeah.
July and back to normal. And actually, to Sophie's point, we're all exhausted. We're all still going around, just making sure that we're relevant. And the high street's picking up, the footfall's picking up. It's all great to see, and I think as long as brands are kind of keeping talking, keeping communicating, then hopefully when we're back to normal, they'll see the benefits of that investment in the time and the strategies, really.
Yeah, and hopefully some of the other challenges that we're seeing around coronavirus and other challenges going on in Britain at the moment. I hope no one's short of petrol, but those sorts of challenges as well, again, it just shows it's not even things like coronavirus, there's other things happening all the time that require businesses to do that. And I mean, one of the things, if I can maybe ask you, Fik, we've seen some of the businesses that we've worked with that seem to be able to kind of accelerate quickly. They seem to have quite agile processes internally. They seem to be able to react quite fast to things. I mean, what do you see as the sort of biggest hurdles that stop that happening in organisations? What are the things that could get in the way of that happening, and what would be your recommendations around moving at pace, the right pace?
I think it starts from the recognition that if the organization is set up in such a way that they are outwardly looking, if they are consumer-centric, that's the principle, right? If that is the case, then I think it's quite easy to kind of be quite reactive internally and gear ourselves and structure ourselves towards meeting those needs. I think often because of, especially for legacy brands and businesses that have been around for quite a while, there's a certain way of doing business that we're used to, and we structure it accordingly. And sometimes we can't lose touch with what's happening outside, and especially with what's important to consumers and customers. So it goes back to marketing one-on-one, right? So it's this idea of really understanding what consumers are looking for. And therefore, if you appreciate the fact that we're here to serve our consumers and shoppers, the idea of really resetting ourselves and reshaping our systems, processes, people, and all towards that. If we manage to do that, I think it makes it easy to be agile. If we're quite inwardly looking, as we are saying upfront, And if it is all about kind of how the organization is structured, then we find it very difficult to try and meet this consumer needs. Just because, we can't be as agile and as speedy as special organizations who are quite new and quite nimble.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that concept of, if you're looking out and you've got the customer at the centre, it's kind of then about how you just arrange yourself to capitalise on that understanding that you have of the marketplace, isn't it? And obviously you've written a book about this sort of area, Sophie. I mean, what's your take on it?
It's probably one of the most common conversations I'm having with marketing leaders at the moment, which is, how can we get that kind of agility ability in marketing teams? And there is definitely an understanding of why it's so important to have that need for speed. And I think Fix just referred to the really interesting comparison there, which is, of course, everybody looks at the fast growth startups with no tech legacy or tech debt and culture debt there, and how fast they can move. But I think it's fascinating when you do see the big super tankers who can move at pace, because then they've got the heft and the resource to make a real difference. So the agility ability piece, I think what people are talking about to me quite a lot at the moment is there's a few things. There's, as we've just referred to, the processes and the structures that help you do that. So lots of people at the moment within the marketing society, marketing CMOs, talking about moving to the Spotify model in terms of squads and how everybody works. There's some structural things. But it's also getting everybody to really understand that actually one of the biggest ways to set the right pace is to be connected to that great understanding of what the customer needs, to be able to make sure that your technology supports that and also that your human understanding supports it. I think there's also the classic original definition of agile, when you look at it from a tech point of view, is always about make sure the person who's closest to the code is able to be empowered to make decisions. And there is definitely something inside organisations where making sure the person who is closest to the customer or the consumer is empowered to make decisions. So seeing the responsiveness of people on social, because you've got people who know they've got the framework, but also the freedom. So giving people the framework and freedom. So social or customer experience in terms of the customer service centre, just making sure that they understand the frameworks and the freedoms. And there are some great examples out there of people who've slowed down to get that set up right, set the values, set the understanding, and then they can move fast.
That's a really interesting concept. And actually, I know, Hannah, when you and I caught up before this panel, it really came across to me just quite how central that customer understanding is to what you guys do at Greggs. I don't know if you could sort of explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we aim to assess about 1 million customer touch points every year in terms of what we're doing and using that insight. So, we're constantly looking out for what is going to be kind of the new trends coming up and how we can adapt our marketing accordingly and hopefully stand out in terms of what we're doing. I think, this hurdles point is really important. I think the culture of the business and the management is something that really enables that kind of freedom and the framework that Sophie's talking about, that empowers people to really go forward with the ideas that they want to. And I think I'm always encouraging my team to come up, we have regular brainstorms as a team, and what would you like to do? What would you like to achieve? How would you like to go after these customers? How could we, change a brand opinion or brand perception about something that may be a legacy point for our brand? And it is difficult sometimes. Sometimes talk to people like, why would you not want to do that? Or could you do this? And sometimes people feel that they daren't, or there's a risk. And I think some of that has come around through social media these days. If you do mess something up or make a mistake, the world literally can see it. And I think it's how we encourage our teams and our people to really think through what they do and robust thinking, but not feel that they are inhibited to really come up with the ideas and the strategies that they would like to pursue, really.
And actually, one of the things I was hoping we could talk about, if we think about that pillar about communicating creatively, I think, at Kantar, I think we've studied over 200,000 adverts now through our linked database, and we know a lot about, what works and what doesn't, but we definitely see creative risk-taking as a real accelerant to advertising performance. And Fik, I know you and I were chatting as well about your recent Marmite out-of-home campaign. I mean, again, could you just talk to us a bit about that? Because, it's a legacy brand, but you took a risk, and that was really interesting, I thought.
So I think when you're dealing with a brand like Marmite that is so iconic, kind of really woven into the British society, it's everything that you do on that brand is quite risky. So you have to be very careful, especially given the divisive nature of the brand. We said it's either loved or hated. Hopefully, most of the audience is a lover, not a hater in this case. But specifically in that instance, for example, as you said earlier this year, we wanted to Marmite Dynamite, which is a chili variant. It's one of our newest innovations. And of course, it has such a beautifully explosive flavor, combining chili, spicy flavors with something like Marmite. And something like that, which has an explosive flavor, deserved an explosive creative to go with it in terms of launching it. And what we did was we wanted to think differently this time around. Instead of, I think, using the kind of the usual tried and trusted measures, we really wanted to do something slightly different that will also help us stand out in culture. Standing out in culture and being unmissable is kind of our North Star that guides us in for any Marmite initiative, whether it's campaigns, innovations, partnerships, etc. So what we did was we launched the product with few out-of-home special builds. So effectively, I don't know, for those who haven't seen it, it basically depicts the aftermath of an explosion of Marmite. So you just see the iconic jar, but with the lid blown off. And the lid will be found somewhere like in front of the out-of-home build, for example, smashed into a car windscreen, or hanging off a wall nearby, or hanging off a tree nearby. And these were just strategically placed dramatic, 1 or 2, 3 type of out-of-home execution. The whole idea was to grab the imagination and the attention of the public, and grab it in a sense that I think just based on those 2, 3 out-of-homes, it went viral on social. It was like wildfire. We did not expect that. And most importantly, also, of course, the PR machine was incredible in the sense that all the kind of the top titles picked it up. And also it was on TV, on all the breakfast shows. It was incredible. And that's one of the most exciting buzz for the brand, and made it one of the most successful innovations we've had for a while. But also, most importantly, the impact on the brand equity and awareness was phenomenal. And to go back to the point Martin was making, this is all about kind of making sure that we create meaningful difference, and it helped us do that. So something like that is, I think, what will continue helping British brands like Marmite stand out in culture and be noticed.
And I mean, if anyone in the audience hasn't seen that creative,
brilliant.
yeah,
Absolutely
I
brilliant.
would go and encourage Googling it, because it's hilarious. The ones with the lid in the smash car, perhaps not so good for the car, but definitely hilarious. And I think no one in the audience would forgive me if I didn't ask you about the vegan sausage roll, Hannah, when we're in the subject of creative risk-taking and general meaningful innovation. Could you just talk us a little bit about that? How did that come about, and how did you approach it?
Sure. I mean, the vegan sausage roll was in development for a number of years. I mean, the food zone team, the food scientists that we have, did a phenomenal job, and the aim of that product was to make it, we would not compromise on the taste of it. So the minute that the formula was, successfully developed in terms of making it taste amazing, then we knew we were onto something. So in terms of the launch, that for us was about looking at the absolute experts. So we knew this would be our biggest product launch that we'd had probably in our history. And in terms of looking out as to who is absolutely exceptional at product launches, we spotted Apple. I mean, their execution, their craft, their attention to detail. The iPhone launch was absolutely phenomenal. And we thought, right, how do we kind of bring some of that to Greggs, but maintain the Greggs humour within it? And so that was what we set about, really. So the packaging that we did, that ends up on Good Morning Britain, and we went to a lot of our influencing groups, a lot of the vegan communities online, etc. And we just kind of pressed the button. I remember about 10 o'clock on the morning in New Year, and it's just started going viral. I was getting on a plane for 2 hours, and I just saw the first 4 comments on Twitter, and I spent 2 hours worrying, to be honest, because they were all about how Greggs had lost our way. We weren't for our core audience, we're alienating our core audience. And I sat fretting on the plane, got off 2 hours later, and the whole thing had gone viral, and it was absolutely phenomenal for the brand and the teams, and the development team and the whole business. Really, it was a really great time. But people talk about that as if it was a really risky piece, but it didn't feel risky at the time, because we were taking inspiration from the absolute masters, but doing it in a way that the execution was really, really outstanding, but had some of that kind of Greggs humour within it as well. So it was a great opportunity to work on, and the teams really enjoyed it. But it was a fundamental turning point, I think, in terms of how the business could start to appeal to new audiences and get people kind of back in the door who might not have been to Greggs for quite some time and seen the journey that the brand has been on.
Well, I definitely remember seeing the queues in the London Bridge Greggs after the launch and thinking, I genuinely would have loved to have gone and tried one on that day, but I just couldn't. The queues were too long. And just thinking more broadly, so we've got two great examples there of creative risk taking that's really paid off. I mean, what do you think gets in the way of other organisations taking those kinds of risks, perhaps?
It's just so fantastic to hear those two examples because they're such great stories, and they're such classic stories of brilliant marketing leadership as well, because that point that Hannah talked about making sure people didn't feel fearful. So I think the biggest thing that gets in the way is always fear. The fundamental enemy of creativity is fear. So if you are leading a group of people and they don't have the kind of psychological safety to be able to explore, to experiment, to try things out, and if you are terrified of getting it wrong, then I think that's a real danger. I think one of the interesting things we often see amongst marketing society conversations is people talking about their failures and, accepting that to be great at marketing, you have to show that things don't work. I remember Keith Weed, who's one of our fellows at ex-Unilever, talking at great length about his worst disasters and it being very important. But he also talks about the desire for marketers to come together to make sure that marketing is seen as a noble profession. So I do think there's a balance here where what we want to do is talk about the fact that this is incredibly hard and risky, and there will be things that go wrong, and share the examples of what happens and where it goes wrong. Another great example recently, we had Gary Coombe, who's the CEO at Gillette, talking about the story behind that campaign, which of course, I think the ad is the most liked ad on YouTube and the most hated, disliked. So it is the Marmite of recent campaigns, but actually understanding how the story behind that and how that actually reshaped the organisation shows that there is more to it than it happens. And I think the examples we've just heard there of the fun and the thrill of taking a risk or doing something differently or doing something that the customer wants, if people feel safe that they're not going to lose their jobs immediately, and that has been an issue for a lot of people during the pandemic. I think people have been fearful. And if we are looking to the long term, and that's why all this data and insight about what long-term brands need to do, we have to have the courage to know there will be some ups and downs, and that if you don't try something, you won't be able to move forward. But it is tricky, and it requires courage and leadership, I think.
And the payoff is just so great, isn't it, for the organisation? But even like just listening to you, Fik and Hannah, talk about, you just get the sense of pride that you and your teams had about producing such a great piece of work that has such a positive effect for the business. It's just really inspiring all round, really, I think, isn't it? And it makes me wonder as well, obviously the debate about long-term brand building, short-term activation has been going on for quite some time. But do you think that the pandemic has changed the way that marketers can make the case around brand ROI? Do you think it is there is a difference now how people are approaching it? I mean, it's interesting, obviously in BrandZ, we would certainly make the case that the brands that had invested in that way before the pandemic are the ones that have come back quicker. Do you think that is something that is felt generally in the marketing industry?
Yes and no. And I think that's why this debate and this discussion is so important, and to arm people with a real understanding of it. I think during the pandemic, for a lot of organisations, it was the CFO who was pressing pause. And I think the conversations that are going on now are very much around the marketing leaders who are pointing out that we now need to press play and fast forward and make things happen. And to do that, again, there's another barrier of fear. Understandably, organisations have not known what's going on, and it's been a world of uncertainty. But marketers are the best at dealing with uncertainty. We never really know when we're taking a risk and when we're trying something, but we can take a calculated risk and we can be brave and bold about doing it. So we're the best positioned people to therefore help organisations understand that there will continue to be uncertainty, but actually there is some data, there's some insight, there's some received wisdom, there's learning. We talked about learning from things across the world, learning from each other, learning from the research that's been done. It's there if we bring it all together to back up what we fundamentally know feels right. But yeah, it is definitely challenging.
Yeah, and Vic, I'd love to ask your opinion on this as well, because I know you're a very passionate believer in sort of the fundamentals of marketing, and what's your take on this?
I think especially some of the data, Martin. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Absolutely, I can.
Some of the data Martin was sharing earlier around how the brands that invested through the pandemic, the brands that believed in long-term investment, how they've managed to increase their presence, their equity, etc. I'm sure there was quite a lot of marketers in the audience who kind of felt vindicated hearing that, right? Because the reality is, I think we've kind of, sometimes we do tend to lose our way, especially when it comes to such seismic shifts in consumer behavior or in the market landscape, etc. We tend to kind of reach out to the easiest thing to do, which is, stop investment. And this is, I'm talking about the industry in general, and stop investment and see, how it pans out. The reality is, I think the marketing fundamentals have not changed ever since, I think, for the last 50, 60 years when the era of modern marketing started. If you want to build a brand, you have to be consistent. Brands are not built overnight. You have to be consistent through thick or thin. You have to make sure that you're in front of consumers, you're relevant to what your consumers are looking for, and you're top of mind. So this idea of meaningful difference and salience, those three principles have always been there, right? So it's just a matter of, do we execute consistently against that, or do we chop and change our strategy depending on what's going on in the market? I think there is room for flexibility, but ultimately we have to stay the course in terms of saying, if you are planning on building brands for the long term, sustainable brands, we have to figure out a way of making sure that we also support them consistently, authentically, with creativity that breaks through in such a way that we have one of the highest salience in the market, so that we are the chosen brand as opposed to kind of the forgotten brand.
And Hannah, what's your take on this as well? Because I know, Martin alluded to in his presentation, but your CEO has been quite vocal about his views on how marketing's played a role.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the ROI point, I wouldn't say that we are in a wildly different place. We have a very low marketing budget, we always have, but I kind of like the challenge that brings, and the team do. We're always thinking about how we can stand out and build saliency with a low marketing budget. But in terms of ROI, what we have done is expedite our digital channel rollout, and naturally those channels are so much more measurable for us. So previously it's very difficult to say, of all the people coming into our shops, what's the impact of the money we're spending on a lot of the point of sale and the digital screens and all those types of activities, because we don't have budgets that take us onto TV and things like that. But we do know now that in terms of ROI on the digital channels that we're doing, we are going to have a lot more information, a lot more ability to test and learn and to do rollouts. And I think the pandemic, in terms of ROI, has given us the time to step back and put in the right measures in place and econometric modelling and things like that. So I do think going forward, we've naturally decided that this has been the opportunity to start putting some of these building blocks in place to make sure we're measuring our effectiveness as much as we can as we do roll out into more measurable channels to customers.
That's really interesting. It sort of speaks a little bit to the point you made about putting frameworks in place to be able to move at even faster pace down the line. And I just wondered, obviously the journeys on and offline have been so different over the last 18 months to what we would normally see. What learnings have you seen marketers take from that, Sophie, in terms of how you evolve brand experience in that sort of different environment?
Listening to this conversation, one of the big things I'm thinking about as the most helpful thing for people who are trying to do things right and do things differently is probably that fundamental understanding that one of the biggest accelerators is to learn from others and to see what's happening there. So Hannah talked about taking Apple as an example for the vegan launch, which is brilliant, because those people who can take an idea from elsewhere and look at it are doing what customers are always doing. I mean, all our consumers are not looking at things in the same category. We all have experiential competition everything that we do is compared to Amazon Prime. It's an experience, whether you're building an airplane or something, or a great consultancy project. So understanding, I think, that experiential competitiveness is probably the biggest and most important way to help people understand what to do. And I just think, again, with this conversation, when it feels pressured and difficult, reminding ourselves that we don't have to do this alone, that there are insights out there. We're talking a lot here about the ROI as well. And I'm thinking about Mark Ritson did a Amplify lecture for us last year, which is well worth checking out if you haven't seen it, which is the classic bothism conversation about the long and short of it. And I think for marketers at the moment, we have to make sure we are building in the and to everything, that we're thinking about what we need to do to survive in the short term as organisations and make sure we hit those short-term targets. But also, today has definitely shown that long-term thriving is important. And experience is everything. It's such a hot topic. So what do we do with that? And how do we understand that by understanding other brands and other brands' experiences as well?
Yeah. And what have you learned, Vic, in terms of that as well? Because obviously, again, the store is the main channel for your brands as well. What's your learnings been? Can you hear me, Vic? I'm not sure you can hear me, unfortunately. Let me ask the question to Hannah and come back. Hannah, we've already touched on it. You guys have had obviously a very different experience with journeys coming on and offline. I mean, what have your learnings been about how people are coming back into the real life experience?
I think the key things for us as how we support digital channels in all of our shops. So we have over 2,000 shops across the UK, and ideally, if you were starting a shop from scratch, you'd have a lane for, say, delivery drivers to come in, a lane for maybe click and collect, all our walk-in customers. And if you think about the size of the average shop, Bregs, that's quite a challenge. So I think the ways that customers are shopping these days and those kind of journeys from a digital purchase into a retail environment are the pieces that we've spent a lot of time really working through to make sure that everybody has a great experience. I think sometimes it's easy that could be an easy time where you've got three queues converging and there's a bit of chaos going on. I think we've really been investing the time to make sure that we can really make those experiences work regardless of how you've ordered your product and where you're picking it up from. But also, again, that point about our colleagues, making sure that it's easy as possible for them to serve different customers from different channels who all actually congregate in our shops on the high streets and retail parks.
Yeah. Vic, you're back. Can you hear me now, Vic?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Brilliant. I was just wondering if, as obviously you're in charge of brands which are very much, have store as a core channel of how people purchase them. What have your learnings been about how the on and offline experience has changed over the last 18 months and what that's meant for your brand and the way you do things?
So the growth of e-commerce, I think the growth of digital in general, the acceleration has been incredible for the past 18 months across the industry, right? And I think grocery has not been spared in a sense that e-com grocery has always been in growth for like a decade or so. But the last couple of months, it's just rocket fuel. And I think for us, we had to really be agile in terms of just making sure that we're equally, when it comes to our consumers and shoppers, we're equally present offline and online. It's all about fish where the fish are, and we can serve them appropriately. That's kind of how we are looking at it. So you'll see, for example, the same type of whether it's product assortment, whether it's promotions, pricing, etc., across all the 6 Ps. We had to be super agile to make sure that our consumers, who all of a sudden started shopping online as opposed to in brick and mortar, feel like they can access our brands and different choices within our brands equally in the same way as they would have in brick and mortar. And that's why we're able to accelerate our growth at the same time as the e-commerce grows, as opposed to being left behind in the category.
Great. Now, as we were talking, I saw my iPad flashing down below. Yeah, I know, exactly. Lots and lots and lots of questions. So we've got 50 minutes, so I'm going to jump from my own questions, my selfish own questions, to audience questions, because there's plenty. So There's a number of different ones. Let me pick on this one first. So the need for peripheral vision is interesting. While marketing teams might understand this, how best can marketers encourage this view across the business? Sophie, could I come to you on that first?
Yeah, good question. And there is never enough time in anyone's diary to do all the things we want to do. But I think it comes back to the fundamental point that actually, as marketers now, our responsibility is not just human understanding when it comes to our audience, whatever that audience is, but human understanding when it comes to our role inside the organisation. And what you've seen, what's been really interesting in the last few months, is marketers increasingly being the ones who are helping with employee morale, with where the organisation is going and playing that role internally. So there is a storytelling aspect internally to help people understand that actually, and showing the evidence of actually taking inspiration from a tech company to launch your vegan role is the way to do it, to look at things differently. But also to give people examples of where things have worked across the world or where the ideas are happening, and to be that person who is the curiosity connector inside the organisation.
That's a nice word.
Makes it more interesting for the rest of the organisation, right? If you're bringing ideas in.
Absolutely. And I think, Vic, you've touched on this a little bit, but someone has asked, they said that they loved the Marmite innovations in comms recently. But Vic, did you have to change plans because of COVID, or were you just doing that as part of business as usual?
I think a combination. So hindsight is always good in terms of retelling the story. But the reality is, yes, we had a certain plan both for 2020 and 2021. And I think having seen what's going on with the market, with our consumers, with our shoppers, of course we had to change our plans. We basically, I think in certain areas, we had to rewrite them from scratch. And that's part of what we were talking about earlier in terms of agility. So it's one thing to have a plan, and we always have a plan, but you have to build in a lot of flexibility so that you can be agile and quickly react to what's happening in the market. Or otherwise, I think just sticking to the original plan on its own for the sake of it does not help in building brands. So the short answer is yes, it was in the pipeline, but ultimately we really had to change our plans and even the timings and the executions, etc., to fit what is going on in the market and in our consumers' lives as well.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And a question for you, Hannah, as well. You talked about the momentum going with the customer experience, and what this person's asking, was it kind of like an all hands on deck response, or did you quickly move to formulating a longer term plan? And I know when you and I talked before, you were talking about quite, a lot of your colleagues have been on furlough for a long period of time as the shops have been shut. How have you, how have you approached it? Has it been a kind of all hands on deck, or what's the longer term sort of move you've made?
Yes, so during the core part of the pandemic, when we were closed, I mean, it was all hands on deck, but from a marketing perspective, that was 2 of us. So the entire team was furloughed because the government support system meant that we could protect as many jobs as possible by accessing that. So that was all hands on deck. But in terms of the points we're talking about, was everything in plan and what we were going to do? Well, less so. I think everything pretty much had to go out the window at that point, because we had no idea when the shops would reopen. It was all about making sure we're communicating with our colleagues and making sure that we're communicating with our customers, and then coming back. I think we've probably replanned about 10 times, and none of it's probably come to fruition because we constantly had to evolve to the circumstances that we've seen. So I'd like to say, in terms of building back, it's always been, a really clear plan, but we have literally just had to react in the moment to how things have gone. But the culture of BrandZ is that everybody is all hands on deck, everybody helps everybody else. And I think that's a great thing about the culture of the business, and why hopefully we've come back with our colleagues in a happy place and our customers as well.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a number of questions actually that came through when Martin was presenting, actually, as well as through our session, around how do we learn what are the things that will stick from the ways that people have changed their behaviours in the pandemic. Sophie, I wonder if I could ask you, do you think longer term a direct-to-consumer model will become more critical in FMCG? That's one of the questions that's coming through.
You would probably place a bet on that, because you can see the way in which things are moving. Again, I'd say let's make sure we're not just looking at what's happening in the UK, that we're understanding what's happening elsewhere. Peter Fisk, who's another Marketing Society fellow, is a brilliant person to follow in terms of constant insights. And when you look at what's happening in Asia and some of the models that are advancing there, or even, I mean, I was in Amsterdam on Monday this week.
Lucky you.
I know, travelling, amazing. But just seeing the way in which they use fintech differently with their QR codes and some of the habits and things. So I think generally, yes, I think we are all wanting and needing, this bit of bothism, which is both the convenience of being able to get things fast and make it happen and be direct, and wanting greater experiences and physical experiences. So yet again, as marketers, we have to make sure we are running plans in parallel and watching to see what happens and thinking a couple of steps ahead. I mean, the metaverse, whole big conversation, making sure we're ready for that as well.
Yes, I'm still trying to catch up on that, on following lots of people on Twitter and trying to get my head around it. Fik, could I ask you about that, obviously, as the owner of some very important consumer brands? What's your take on that question around the direct-to-consumer in the future?
I think DTC has seen a massive revival, of course, through COVID for obvious reasons. In terms of whether this is going to stick or not, it depends on the brand, it depends on the category, would be the simple one, in a sense that where the specific FMCG category and brand can add value to shoppers and consumers, value that shoppers and consumers cannot find through their usual, whether it's brick and mortar or e-com channels, or through the experiences that they're seeking. If they can't find value through the usual channels, and if the brand can identify that, absolutely, there's a role for that. But it will not be just because distribution on its own cannot be the value for DTC. It has to be a lot more than that. The question is, can the brand crack that, understand what consumers are looking for, and provide that? That's the only way it can sustain for a particular category.
Thank you. And I mean, as I say, there's a lot of questions coming through, and I think a number of them we've sort of touched on as we've gone through. As we're coming sadly towards the end of the panel, I just wonder if you could give sort of one piece of advice or one thing you would like to see the marketing industry doing differently. Maybe I can start with you, Hannah. What would your thought be on that?
This is such a tough question, because where do you want to go? But my view is marketing is such a fantastic career, and I might be heavily biased, but we don't see as many people coming through, the talent pipeline. And I think for the marketing industries, how do we understand what are these barriers to people pursuing marketing as a career? Because it's got the wonderful balance of everything. It's got the creativity, it's got the commerciality, it's got a bit of legal thrown in, it's got a bit of risk. It's such a lovely rounded profession. It's great fun, really challenging and so rewarding that, how do we fill this pipeline as an industry with fantastic talent that really sends people on their ways career-wise? So it's probably a bit of a rambly answer, but something about talent and really encouraging people to take roles in marketing, because it's just a brilliant career path.
Yeah, and that's where we get the diversity of ideas. The peripheral vision is by having a mix of different people in the industry, isn't it? Of course, you're quite right. Fik, what would your thing be?
I think firstly, I agree with Hannah. Sorry, you're saying marketing is an amazing and excellent profession to have. Absolutely, and I'm biased, yes, but I agree with you. This is a fabulous profession to have. I think from what I'd wish more, or what we as marketers more, is what we were discussing earlier, which is the idea of risk taking, specifically for brands that have such a long heritage and legacy, brands that have been around for quite a while. I think we've kind of lost in a way, and this is a massive generalization, I don't see a lot of risk taking, in a sense that muscle memory has dissipated a little bit. I wish we were bolder around creativity, a lot more disruptive, a lot more dramatic in terms of just really being making sure that the presence of our brands are felt. And I think because, especially for those brands that have been around for a while, there's always this tendency to say, I don't want to be the person who screws up this brand that has such a fabulous equity. But I wish we do more of that so that the brands continue to thrive and continue to be what they've been for the last, decade. So that's the bit I wish we do more of, this idea of taking more risks and boldness in creativity.
I sincerely hope Marmite keep taking risks with their innovation, because your cashew nuts, Marmite cashew nuts, if anyone, Sophie's agreeing with me, and the new Marmite cheese pinwheels at Marks and Spencer's, I probably shouldn't be advertising, but they again, I can't leave those alone. Sophie, what would be your one thing?
Well, I love this, and my one thing would therefore be, to echo a couple of the comments made already today, I think we should be feeling good about being in marketing, to wear that name with pride and to show more examples of what we can do, because this is our moment, right? This is the moment when actually everybody's reconsidering and understanding what's happening with business and brands. This is our moment to help, to step up and to feel good about what we're doing, because I think there's some brilliant examples of what great marketing leadership can achieve. I guess I would also just say, though, it's really important to remind ourselves that we don't have to do it alone. So, we're a community at the Marketing Society, we're a profession as marketeers. Yeah. When we come together like we have today, when we have these conversations, when we work with people, we can help accelerate each other's success by sharing the stories and the insights that are out there. And that makes it also feel even more exciting and positive.
And I think, that feeling of having support of other industry professionals and inspiring ideas, it helps that risk taking, doesn't it? As I said earlier, you can just hear the pride when I talk to you, Fik and Hannah, about the amazing work your teams have done. You can just feel the pride of the whole organisation about that great work and being talked about across Britain and across the world, So it's really inspiring. Sadly, we are almost out of time, but it's been such a great discussion. Thank you, Fik and Hannah, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Sophie, for being here with me. There's a number of different things I've certainly taken from it. I think this concept of peripheral vision, this concept of looking for ideas, is really critical. We've touched on risk taking a number of times, haven't we? In innovation, in creativity, in a number of different areas, and that sort of that payoff of taking those risks and what it can deliver back to the organisation. And I think as well, just really great to hear about the enthusiasm we have for the industry and the passion that resides in our industry as well, which is fantastic to hear. So enormous thank you. Thank you to those of you. I'm so sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions because there were really a lot, but we will try and come back where we can. But thank you ever so much for everybody's time. Really appreciate it. And stay tuned for lots more great things happening during the day here at Kantar Talks.